Started. My name is Camille Nebaker. I'm one of the MPIs for the Ethical and Trustworthy AI Center for the Bridge Center. And we host this forum every month. We bring in speakers from within and external to Bridge to AI to speak about what we're finding to be really interesting ethical, legal, and social implications of the work that we're doing. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nicholas G. Evans. He's an associate professor of political science at UMass Lowell, where he directs the Mind Lab. He specializes in ethics at the intersection of infectious disease, emerging technologies, and national security, with current projects on AI ethics funded by the NIH, U.S. Army Research Laboratory, and the Greenwald Foundation. He's best known for his expertise in dual-use research of concern and public health ethics, and is the author of several books published by MIT Press, including Gain of Function, which has been a topic that comes up often in my scientific ethics courses, and War on All Fronts, a theory of health security and justice. And he's also involved with our AI Ready Grand Challenge and has been doing research to inform ethical decision making. And I'm not sure if that's what you're going to be talking about today, but I am looking forward to hearing from you. So I'll turn it over to you, Nick.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Camille. It's great to be here. And I guess to you and anyone else, if you want someone to come and talk about gain of function research in scientific ethics courses, I wrote about gain of function for my PhD dissertation the year that the first gain of function paper came out. So I've been there from the start, as it turns out. But that's not what I'm here to talk to you today. I'm going to talk about a political polling method that I'm deploying as part of my work with AI Ready and its connection to larger questions in ELSI. And so with that, I will share my screen and we will get started. So the title that I gave Brittany, who I'm really appreciative of for working through the logistics of this talk with me, is Conjoint Analysis of Perspectives on Ethical Trade-offs in Data Generation Projects. Now, as a disclaimer, I receive money from a variety of federal sources, even more of those sources, depending on the outcomes of certain legal action that's ongoing. But I want to kind of express that my views do not reflect any of my funders, past or present, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, or the US government and its respective agencies. As Dr. Nebaker correctly said, I am the co-PI of the Mind Lab at UML, which does have a connection to psychology through my co-investigator, Dr. Neil Shortland. Mind stands for Modeling Individual and Network Decisions. So we do a range of work at the intersection of psychology, so individual, and then political science being the networked component of that. I'm not going to go through all of the wonderful people who have helped on various aspects of my thinking on this project and the project itself, except to say that Colleen Hughes, who is one of my grad students, is responsible for putting together the work on the survey so far, and thus is bolded for that reason. I've also been the beneficiary of a number of really important conversations with people in the AI Ready group. Again, I'm not going to read through all of their individual contributions for the sake of time, but I do appreciate the fact that since I've joined as of December 2024, and the difficulty in starting on a 4-year data collection project in the 3rd year of said project, that the people at AI Ready have been so welcoming, and also the larger ethics community within the Bridge to AI program. So today I want to talk about conjoint studies as a method in political opinion and political science. I want to tell you about what they are, what is their use as a method, and then how they can benefit ELSI research. I then want to talk about the current project that I'm participating in and developing, its background, its current project, and a little bit of preliminary data. And then I want to finish with a couple of asks, one about your participation in these surveys as we deploy them, and then also as a call for additional collaborations, because I am passionate about the use of this method as an interesting way to clinch certain outstanding problems in the empirical literature on ELSI. And I hope that you will come to see that as we move along. So conjoint studies have a really interesting history. They were originally a psychology method, and then they I mean, they were used a little bit in sociology and economics over the intervening decades, but they really were perfected in, of all things, the market research community. Now, in a piece of, as one of my best friends refers to as Nick's Law, I actually spent 6 years as a market researcher and political poller during my undergraduate years. That's how I staved off starvation as an undergraduate physics major. And I did a lot of these without quite knowing what they were or how they work statistically, because my job was not to understand that. My job was to charm people into giving up 15 to 20 minutes of their time to answer questions about Coca-Cola or the Australian Labor Party or something like that. Um, in 2015, through the works of, among others, people at the University of Pennsylvania, one of my alma maters, they migrate back into the political science and social scientific kind of community in force in about 2015. And their primary use, I think more than 30% of quantitative conjoint method studies in political science happen in political opinion and in study of voters. So I've got an example here from a fairly influential study from back in 2018 by Abrahano and colleagues, where what they look at is they want to understand, in particular in this study, they want to understand the role that images play in understanding political candidate support. So what they do is they set up a series of hypothetical candidates, and they say the following are running for city council. They give you the candidate name, their military service, their education. This is American politics, by the way. So military services plays the role that it does here in the United States. Um, their political party, their race and ethnicity, and then some other information. Now, what you don't see is that randomly participants will be assigned a picture underneath the candidate name. And so this acts as a control that is randomly introduced to the participants, where the idea is to pull out the partial causal effect of just the picture amongst the wide range of other information we receive about political candidates as we form our political beliefs and we go to the voting registry. Um, Now, as you might have guessed, one of the reasons that 2015 is such an important historical moment for political science is this is when the online survey panel really enters into its maturity. So groups like MTurk, Prolific, VSync, and a number of other groups learn to kind of collate panelists in really accurate ways and then create very easy to use online platforms for deploying surveys fast and at scale. And in fact, I am a kind of, I guess, related through department affiliation to the UML Center for Public Opinion, which I believe is currently the eighth best ranked pollsters in the entire of the United States of America. As kind of members of this public research university, they kind of, trade blows with Pew and Gallup kind of for their kind of dominance in their ability to extract accurate political information, including using methods like this. So, what a conjoint study is, and on the left is a picture from a conjoint study that I did as part of some Air Force sponsored research on the role of human enhancement in military strategic decision making. Because I am a white boy from Australia, so of course I have views on human enhancement for those of you who are knowledgeable about bioethics history. Is a conjoint study involves three layers. It involves profiles, which are large, the kind of large scale unit of deployment in a conjoint study. So this is a hypothetical vignette about a political candidate or an ethical decision. And then within each profile, there is a series of attributes. And then each of those attributes have a series of items attached to them. And so what happens is that within the profiles, attributes are held usually invariant, and then the items within the attributes are the things that are randomized. So as you can probably imagine, if you have n attributes, each with two items in it, then you have 2 to the n possible perturbations of the profile. And then there's a number of other important considerations that goes into that. One is whether you use single or paired slash multiple profiles. So the previous page had paired profiles where the respondent gets two possible combination sets at the same time. But the way that I use them typically, and that we've used them in ELSI research before, is to use single profiled, where someone is given a single kind of usually narratively constructed set of attributes that they then have to make a decision about. The size of the attribute pool matters for sampling because the more um, uh, attributes and their items means that the number of perturbations scale exponentially the more you add, which means that potentially you can come up with an impossible number of perturbations for a sample size. And then, of course, the number of questions you want to ask someone about each vignette or each set of profiles matters because you can get people to answer more than one question, as I'll go through for each vignette. Or profile. So in the study that I did with with Ryan Chandler, who's a GA Tech, and Michael Gross, who is at the University of Haifa, we gave each respondent a particular story about the use of an enhancement technology or a technology that might be enhancement, and then a series of outcomes that kind of resulted from their use. And then we asked the respondent, is this a case of human enhancement or not? And then, is it ethical to do this or not? And then we looked at commonalities and divergences amongst populations as a function of the minor variations to the story that come with the randomizations of those items. So, why use conjoint studies? The first is the data. So, with a sufficiently large sample, you can get a really large set of fine-grained, multi-dimensional data that is tractable to real-world problems. The reason that they're so useful in political opinion studies is that you can construct stories about a particular group of candidates that are extremely fine-grained. And for those of you who have done work on the role of cases in bioethics, we know that the more detail you have in a case for judging its kind of ethical content, the better people often do. But you can also check people's fine-grained changes in those beliefs by changing a single item. And you can also pull out their hidden priorities. Psychologists will tell you that if you ask someone if race matters in a political candidate, no one's going to admit to that. But if you include it as part of a very large story, you can pull out the causal inference that race plays based on its featuring in a range of other stories. You can also look at people's baseline beliefs by pulling that item out and having it be a null value, and seeing where the null value exists relative to other categorical variables. So you can also reveal people's baseline beliefs, their kind of unstated defaults in the story. Statistically, these are also very tractable, model-thinned sets of questions. So you can measure marginal means as a way to understand convergence or divergence in a population around particular attributes, which is simply the proportion of people who respond to a certain question in a certain way, varied by all other item measures. You can also do kind of causal inference using what is called average marginal component effect, where you measure the way that a single change in an item leads to a statistical change in the confidence intervals around someone's responses to a vignette. And I can share a really good a really good YouTube video of someone explaining, the guy who invented the AMCE protocol explaining AMCs, because I am not a political statistician, and thus you should not take me at my word for exactly how those statistics are developed. I use them. I can't pretend to be the guy who invented them. Um, so, in the ELSI community, there is a small set of studies that use conjoint methods, but it is very small. It's a little bit larger in terms of looking at medical preferences and medical decision making, because much like marketing people, medical device designers want to know about small, fine level changes in people's preferences, for example, in how medical devices are engineered. And so they have done conjoint studies amongst populations about their preferences regarding things like diagnostics all the way through to invasive medical devices. Um, they had the use of multifactorial designs gives substantive benefits that are well suited to the needs of the community, because these fine-grained changes allow you to change the details of ethically laden stories in ways that allow you to make tractable which features of the case are most important to people, which obviously doesn't solve the certain kind of naturalistic barriers that come with measuring people's beliefs as opposed to what they ought to do. But it does give you an interesting set of data around the ability to create or lose convergence of a community around particular issues, around features that you might not expect. And of course, its statistical benefits give ELSI new tools in a world where some of the best ELSI research is qualitative, and it serves a really important function in telling people's stories and how they experience certain things. But when it comes to population level descriptors, ELSI working groups at the NIH have long said that there is a need for expanded methodologies, particularly in improving our quantitative methodologies, which are often less well developed than our qualitative methodologies. And I think that this gives us something to work with to really understand what it is that patient and public communities, but also expert communities, understand about the ethical issues of the day. Um, some decisions need to be made. So this is the wonderful Kate Spector Baghdadi at the University of Michigan, together with W. Nicholson Price, her colleague. They just in JAMA Network Open. I saw this thanks to the wonders of social media a week ago while I was drafting these slides. They just released a conjoint study about a trust in AI in healthcare, with a particular emphasis on diagnostics in dermatology as their subject and their profile group. And so they presented people with paired profiles where they said, imagine that you're going to a uh, a physician's office and you're getting a diagnostic for a rash. Here are a series of conditions that obtain to the visit, and we want you to pick which one of these you would feel more comfortable with. So they vary the amount of information that you received about AI training data, its purported quality. So is it better than a specialist at detecting pathology? Is it the same as a specialist, about the same as a general practitioner, and then worse than a general practitioner? And then a number of other binary choices. As you will see, the work that I'm doing involves single choices, and part of that is because I am interested in what my colleague and co-PI, Dr. Neil Shortland, would refer to as least worst decision making. So a lot of my work involves putting people in ethical dilemmas and then asking what they would do, often recognizing that I have not necessarily provided them with a series of great choices. And so I'm not asking you what is the best choice. What I'm asking you to do is tell me what you would endorse someone doing in a particular choice based on an individual profile, rather than telling me which of two profiles you would prefer. Um, because obviously some of these profiles where nothing goes wrong and nothing bad happens are kind of trivially preferable to others. So I'm interested in what you do in the moment. And then there's also outcomes. Are you endorsing the choice? Are you recognize it as an ethical issue in the first place? Are these categorical opinions or binary conditions where you do or don't do something? Is it level of endorsement on a scale of 1 to 5, or is it a more thermometer based, like 1 to 100, and so on? So, the current project to me is really interesting as someone. So, my postdoctoral training was at the University of Pennsylvania with Jonathan Moreno, who is a historian of bioethical decision making. And he and I bonded because I wrote about bioethics and national security, and he writes about bioethics and national security. And we are two of, I think, seven people who do that. And one of the things that he commented to me when I told him that I had joined AI Ready and the Bridge to AI program is that hypothesis agnostic research is historically very old in bioethics, but as a proportion of the literature about which it has been discussed is quite new, right? And that's because some of the oldest historical controversies in bioethics were in part hypothesis agnostic, right? The Tuskegee syphilis experiment, just as a really important disclaimer, I am not saying that anyone's doing anything like that in our current community. What I am saying is that our original ethical controversies, like Tuskegee, were natural history studies, right? Where we didn't necessarily have a hypothesis about the way that syphilis evolved in a community. We just wanted to watch what happened. The one that I am much more au fait with in terms of my background, which is from which the picture on the right is taken, are the human radiation studies in which people were injected without their knowledge or consent with plutonium, usually. And then their life history was collected repeatedly over intervening years and decades in order to understand what it was that people were experiencing as a function of being exposed to radiation, right? These were the collections of enormous data sets. And of course, we had very early objections to them from an ethical perspective because they were done without people's consent, knowledge, and with extremely dangerous conditions, or they were denied available medical care, such as in the case of Tuskegee. Um, we didn't really stop in the process to argue what are the finer grained ethical problems that might emerge from hypothesis agnostic research. And we all know now, as after years, for some of you, a year in my case, of studying them full time, that DGPs have numerous challenges and ethical issues along their life cycle. And life cycle is really important. Ethical issues arose for Bridge to AI on day one, and they will continue to arise right up until our final sustainability models are written. Um, and there is a divergence in beliefs about when we should engage with, for example, recontacting participants, how sustainability features into the overall ELSI kind of understanding of a DGP. And there is divergence around broader ethical principles about what it means to do hypothesis agnostic research. Is this interventional kind of under our understanding of research ethics, or is this closer to public health ethics? So this is the perfect time to conduct a conjoint study amongst the expert population of Bridge to AI and then of Bridge to AI compared to the rest of the community, or compared to people who are not actively engaged in this kind of research that is like Bridge to AI, these kind of hypothesis agnostic data generation projects, to understand how they manage ethical issues. So, with that in mind, over the last 6 months, my team have been constructing a conjoint study of this kind. So, because I am interested in part in the potential for hard choices, we chose a single profile study. And what we do is we present respondents with a vignette much like the one on the left. I am not impairing the epistemics of this study by showing it to potential participants because, as you will find out, we are still tweaking this quite substantially in response to early feedback. Um, so the vignette reads about a project in the biomedical sciences aiming to generate a large clinical data set. And it gives you a time frame, um, and then it gives you the expectations of the quality of the research. And then it tells you about an issue, not an ethical issue, an issue that has come up. Um, it could be participant safety. It could be the external validity of the data set. It could be long-term indirect harms. There are a number of issues that we provide. It then tells you that you can resolve the issue, but it would mean that there would be a consequence for choosing, as they often are, for choosing to immediately resolve this issue. And this consequence can vary from an extra $50,000 to the budget that you somehow have to find, through to project termination, through to kind of the mistrust of the public in virtue of finding out about a certain issue. And then you can defer it. You can choose not to solve the issue right now, but it's going to also have a number of consequences. And so we randomize these attributes according to their items, and then we divvy these out, and participants are given a sequence of these stories that they have to answer. At the moment, we're piloting 10, and we may make choices about more or less depending on participant feedback. The result, single profile, 5 attribute, 512 perturbations in the instrument. Now, you don't need a statistically meaningful number of participants to answer each profile. What you tend to need for the statistics is you need a sufficient number of people assigned to each item within the attribute profile in order to make meaningful sense out of this statistically. So we're not trying to get 50 by 512 participants to participate. We could do that for a public study, but that would cost money that we don't have right now to do this work. So we've piloted this at the moment among student and faculty from 5 colleges within a large R1 university. Given my affiliation, I will leave you to guess which one that is. And so far, actually, as of this afternoon, we have 100 responses, but the data is collected from here from 80 responses so far. Recall, 10 questions per respondent means that they have collectively reduced 800 profiles. And the marginal means are here on the right. Because it is quite a small diagram, I will give you some of the top line notes so that you can understand these kind of early observations. And the first is that there is not orthogonality between ethical and choosing to defer the choice and whether or not you perceive the choice to be ethical. So we ask you both questions in this survey right now. And what we discover is that in many cases, the willingness to accept or defer the choice depends strongly. There's a strong relationship between that and whether or not you perceive the choice to be ethical or not, which shouldn't surprise us, right? If people think that ethical choices are more meaningful in some way than mere technical choices, then we should expect that. There is divergence, though. In particular, if the consequence of damage to trust in science is the consequence of avoiding, people are less likely to view this as an ethical issue than if any other consequence is provided, but are still very likely to think that you ought to that you ought to resolve this right now rather than defer it. So in that case, for example, even though you're less likely to find participants agreeing that this is an ethical choice, that trust in science is kind of makes this an ethical choice, they're still likely to think that for whatever reason, we don't give them open-ended responses at this time. You need to choose to address the issue right now rather than to defer it. There's also it turns out no relationship, statistical or otherwise, between the impact of the research and people's views. So there is almost no difference between telling them that this is going to be a transformative data set versus an incremental data set. We don't use precisely those wordings as to whether or not people think that the issues raised are ethical issues, or whether or not they think that you ought to resolve them. So there is no relationship between this research being of exceptional quality and exceptional impact on patient outcomes to whether or not they think that this is an ethical issue that needs to be resolved right now, or whether they think that it can be simply deferred until later. So one of the outcomes is that we feel that we might need stronger signals for consideration. It's nice to establish consensus views amongst participant groups, but a lot of these signals are not yet statistically significant, which might tell us something about the ways that we have constructed these instruments rather than actual beliefs about the communities. We don't want to force people into meaningless ethical decisions to create signal, but we also want to make sure, and we're going to be doing long-form cognitive interviews with participants, which we've just started, to understand whether it's the actual structure of the device that is causing them to think this. Now, That said, we can actually pick out statistical changes from the 80 respondents presented here. In particular, people are less likely to view something as an ethical issue um, if it involves damage to trust in science, uh, or if it involves the consequence of avoidance being the project's termination. Um, we don't know that this is a kind of a real world meaningful result, but we do find it interesting. Project determination also reduces, and this might be meaningful in the real world, reduces the likelihood that someone is to say that you ought to choose to engage with the issue up front, and makes them more likely to say that you ought to defer the issue at a later time. Um, the other thing is that by and large, people are likely to recognize the issues as ethical, according to marginal means, but they are statistically less likely to view them as ethical issues, these vignettes as describing ethical issues, if the issue presented is that something about the results of the data generation project might compromise trust in science. So there might actually be something about the way the data has been created that could compromise trust in science. Doesn't seem to elicit as strong a signal about whether or not people think this is an ethical issue. And they're even less likely to think it's an ethical issue and less likely to favor a response as opposed to deferring the response if the issue is to the external validity of the data set. So they don't tend to find as much that the data set being that the creation of the data set being tractable to real world patient outcomes as being an ethical issue as compared to patient safety or to data security or something like that. So the science might be compromised, but they don't tend to think that that's as much of an ethical issue, as other issues. And they also are less likely to think that we ought to accept certain costs and address the issue than they would if, for example, patient safety was in the mix. So, what's next for us? So we're going to complete some cognitive interviews and we're going to engage in a bit of survey redesign. We're going to think about whether we want classical reference measures, right? Most of our issues that are deemed classical are patient harms, right? Because these are usually thought to be the kinds of things about which people are concerned when they think about biomedical ethics. What we might do is, at least for costs and consequences, is we might just leave the vignette blank. So we might describe there being no cost to resolving this issue or no consequence for avoiding it as a way to better understand our reference measure. Um, We've also been asked by at least one expert who has taken this survey whether we would ask participants whether we would ask survey participants whether the hypothetical participants in this hypothetical study should be recontacted as part of resolving the issue, right? So does the issue that presents itself within the vignette rise to the level that they think that participant recontact or reconsent is necessary? Because this is often something that's viewed as critical in conversations around broad consent within biomedical research. We're also going to tweak some of the actual survey measures as to whether we want a binary or a continuous rating of whether something is an ethical issue or their evaluation of the accepting the choice or rejecting the choice, whether we want more of an endorsement rather than choice making. What's next for you? So obviously, please take our survey once we've finished it. We have kind of got our final amendments together. The expert study will be a snowball sample, so we will distribute it widely, or we plan to distribute it widely in the Bridge community, but we are also inviting people to then send it on to their colleagues because we want to collect as much expert view as we can. We understand that snowball surveys have particular limitations. We think that the limitations of a snowball study in this case are less than the limitations that might arise from only interviewing the Bridge community. So please forward it to your colleagues once it's out. And then also, this is my invitation about what other questions you would like us to ask, whether it's in this study or whether there are other ways that this method could be applied to ELSI questions that are critical to your projects, and then in what contexts we should do so, right? Whether we should look at the structure of community engagement and present vignettes of different projects with different community engagement structures. The classic community engagement board versus more deficit model communication or something like that. Whether we should try and see if we can pick up signals about beyond the Indigenous community, whether ordinary citizens have more of a preference for the FAIR principles versus the CARE principles, and how we would design a study like that, and whether there are any others. So with that, I want to give as much time to people as I can to ask questions. So I will conclude there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Nick. That is so interesting. I remember that you had sent this survey, and I believe Ellen commented, and then it got lost somewhere in my to-do list. So I'm curious about going back to it. You're using the term pilot, and I'm wondering if it's kind of really beta. So are you
Yeah,
developing this all right now and getting feedback from 100 people on how they're answer? I mean, that's a pretty big sample. And then you're going to go back and do cognitive interviews with all of the people that are helping you build it.
we are asking people if they would consent to being recontacted and interviewed using a cognitive interview method. We only anticipate that we will probably do 20 to 30 cognitive interviews over the entire sample base. I love a large N qualitative study, but I didn't feel that this needed like 100+ cognitive interviews for measure design. What we really wanted to do was
Right.
get a sample of different kinds of respondents, especially because we have the advantage here at UMass of the public health department has interviewed their or has distributed this to their undergraduate, graduate, and faculty students. Our biomedical engineering department has done this, and a number of other healthcare adjacent data collection groups within the within the university. So we have a lot of people who are very adjacent to the kind of community that Bridge is, that I then want to be able to drill into, not just for the PIs, but to understand how the graduate students, the interns, et cetera, really understand some of these issues and whether or not we're asking the right or wrong questions. But we're going to leave end of 20 to 30.
It's still a really big undertaking. It's a lot of, I mean, I just love what you're doing. It's super interesting.
We The last piece to that is that Ellen Clayton, our very own Ellen Clayton, kind of asked me if I was willing to do this as a public survey in addition to being an expert survey, and my answer was, of course, sure, if I could find the money to do that. But in preparation for that, and given that there was already enthusiasm by, a senior member of the community for doing a public survey, I want to make sure that the measure is able to be tractable to the public. And that requires the kind of work in measure design that I wouldn't necessarily need to do if I was only caring about the bridge community. So that's part of the reason for doing all this.
Oh, thanks for, I mean, it's just so robust. I think it's going to really be a valuable study. And I
Thank you.
and I am looking forward to going back to it. Before I ask it more questions, because I do have them, I just want to open it up to others in the room to ask Nick about what his work is, what about his presentation. Julia.
Hi, Nick. Thank you so much for that incredible talk. I want to congratulate you on the work for two reasons. One, I can appreciate what an undertaking this is. I think it's going to be really valuable to the entire Bridge community. But also, I selfishly am really interested in seeing this kind of empirical work infuse itself with the ELSI space. I was involved in an early effort in bioethics. With Brian Earp and others to try to bridge some of these infrastructures in with normative reasoning, though the way to do that is, of course, a little bit fraught for the reasons you alluded to in terms of thinking about what people believe versus how they ought to think about some of these challenges. I am personally involved in the ethics pillar of the CM Grand Challenge with cell maps, and we have a manuscript that is hopefully coming out soon. That is the result of fairly extensive qualitative interviews that we did with people within our grand challenge about how they conceived of ethics issues, also trade-offs between technical mastery rate optimization versus certain values that either had intrinsic or instrumental value. So I would love to know in relation to your work, certain things you were pointing to, for instance, like external validity being a poor predictor of ethical salience for the people that I mean, that aligns pretty closely. A lot of the things that you said align closely with what we're seeing from qualitative interviews, with some specific areas where maybe things are coming apart. Um, my question, or I guess it's really maybe a comment, is that I think the public facing part of this could be really valuable, and the way it links to what I was saying earlier is that I think one of the values of this kind of work, in addition to the many values it offers, is being able to probe asymmetries and how experts and lay people are thinking about some of these trade-offs, right? If it turns out that external validity is not like right stock and barrel ethics issues that experts are routinely recognizing, but they can be couched in terms that are linked to patient safety or latch into patient-facing harms in ways that can be made perspicuous to the public, right? You can imagine how these things might diverge and come apart, and that can predict conflict and buy-in issues, things that latch into trust. So I'm just wondering, does that resonate with you at all? Would that be valuable for your work? And what does it mean if these questions are answered differently by different people within the bridge to AI space? I'm sorry, that's a very long question.
That's fine. I've never had the pleasure of meeting Brian, but I know that he's now working with my good friend and mentor Julian over at NUS. So I hope that he's doing well in Singapore, which is a fabulous city and country to live in. Um, I I have a lot of views, as a philosopher by training, but also a dude who left physics for philosophy because partly because coding was exhausting, and now does a lot of coding in R. That I the naturalistic fallacy is something that I find really interesting because I think that there's a real desire for empirically tractable results. But the question is, how do you then kind of apply them to normative issues? And this is just how I kind of think about it. One is that I think that the quant-qual transition is really important for understanding larger normative references. And the way that we often do it, part of it's a kind of a matter of contingency because as the PI, I'm the quant guy, and then all my postdocs are qual people. So we start with my interests, and then we do their interests, and they do all the ethnographies and long form interviews, and then we kind of come up with the like larger normative papers. But I think that qualitative interviews give us better understanding into people's relationship to institutional structures. And much like Alex London's recent book for the common good, I think that one of the things that a lot of research ethics rests on that is a mistake is what Alex calls the transactional view of research ethics, right? I think that not only is that normatively unjustified, but I think that that lack of normative justification does meet public beliefs about the nature of science, right? When you look at Pew results, you see that people give their information to science for altruistic reasons, and they do it because they believe that they are helping themselves and their communities to live better lives. And if we can use some of these quant methods to understand where that comes apart, I think that that's a really valuable piece of this puzzle. And one of the benefits of conjoint studies over qualitative studies in this particular instance is that we can do it with 20,000 people as long as you give us enough money. And we can do it with 20,000 perturbations and do fine-grained causal analysis to understand what is being pulled out of the story over a population level.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said, and I'm glad you feel that way. And I would love to talk more, but I don't want to hog the Q&A.
Cool.
Can I ask a question that builds on that one though? Is there so still trying to wrap my head around the conjoint analysis. I've seen them, but I haven't done one of these since I was a grad student. And I'm curious, I typically think of like the range of forms of analysis that one can use. And I think about it in terms of, what is the goal and what is the state of what we know as a way of determining how to choose it. So I'm trying to figure out where conjoint analysis fits in that sort of range. Is it an alternative to other forms of survey because the state of knowledge is sufficiently developed that you can kind of codify your items? Or is it a little bit, does it lean more toward qualitative? So that's sort of where does it fit in that continuum? And then the second question is like, is there like a set of factors that exist that have been where conjoint analysis have been compared to those alternatives, like the expense of it versus the power to detect something causal, that sort of stuff?
Yeah. Yeah, so in the last decade, a lot of work has been done on the statistical question, and because that's been one of the big public opinion controversies, right, about the degree to which some of these things are statistically tractable in the right kinds of ways. Um, in terms of their use, I don't view them as an alternative to qualitative methods. And in fact, we're putting together a grant that, to my comment to Julia, that we're submitting. Hopefully, I mean, he's just agreed to it with Aaron Lee about combining conjoint methods for large scale data collection and then following it up with ethnographies in places like academic medical centers, but also startups around ophthalmological diagnostic creation to understand how some of the insights we pull out of the conjoint methods then translate into and if they can be squared with the qualitative questions. And the way that we're thinking about it, and we're one of the first groups, as far as I know, to try and pair these things. So we're making the rules up as we go along, is that conjoint studies replace other forms of public opinion based survey methods, right? And the thing that they do is that they allow us to um, use tools from causal inference to understand the marginal contributions of elements within a story to the ways that people respond to that story. So a lot of early like ELSI research is patient preferences research where the study exists in like 3 or 4 well-defined blocks that are created by the researchers who then ask people to respond to it. And what we're able to do predominantly through the computer survey age is to create hundreds or thousands of the same story that measure these things in much more fine-grained ways. But I don't think that necessarily says anything about its relationship to the qualitative story. And so one of the thing that I am hoping to get good results back from the Boston District Court at the end of April is that we had received $4 million from the US Army to try and square part of that problem from their psychologists group. And I'm hoping that we can get back to that in the second half of this year to actually try and answer some of the questions about how we mesh our qualitative knowledge creation with this particular kind of quantitative knowledge creation.
Hmm.
I'm going to jump in with another question. This is really rich and it's hard to understand. So I'm kind of struggling as well to follow Sarah's questions. But now I'm thinking about all the variations on the story
Mhm.
and thinking about all the variations in the people and the context and what they may have just been primed with. That is maybe, I remember teaching citizen scientists how to do research, and one woman couldn't figure out why her blood pressure was always so high after she talked to her mother-in-law. So I'm just saying that this context is so immediate
Mhm.
that how do you control for that?
So, I mean, a couple of things. One is that that's actually one of the great features of randomization, right? Is that we can, because we randomize the stories across the participants, much in the way that we randomly allocate people to interventions in clinical trials, we can scrub some of those variations by kind of blinding ourselves to who gets which vignette. So that's one answer. The other is that we do regression modeling the same as anybody else to kind of in quantitative studies to understand the way that certain covariates influence the relationships. So I didn't present any of the covariate and subgroup based analysis because we don't have enough people for it in the pilot. But we collect gender, race, and ethnicity. We collect disability status because we have an a priori story that we have about the role of people who seek chronic medical care versus people who just go to the doctor when they're sick occasionally about their relationship to medical data collection based on the philosophy of disability literature. We select for education. We also select for STEM field. And then we also, in the expert study, will select for subspecialties, right? So we will ask people, if you are participating in a data collection project or data generation project, which of these fields are you engaging in? Is it clinical medicine? Is it infectious disease? Is it public health? So on and so forth. Because we do have a theory that, you know, much like doctors who smoke, there are probably plenty of geneticists who don't have a good relationship with their own family history of illness or something like that. So we want to be able to attend to the idea that people's subspecialties may or may not give them different kinds of priming. So we have a fairly well developed kind of covariate set that is a lot of it is primed around. Some of them are standard to make it kind of accessible and interoperable with other data, but then some of it is very specific to the expert survey to try and understand whether the experts are just different regarding their priming for various beliefs about the normative status of some of these issues.
Thank you. Sam and then Anna.
Yeah, I loved your presentation, Nick, and I had never really thought of conjoint analysis as being such a good auxiliary method to qualitative, because the very fact that it is rich in context in so many different contexts will at least tell you whether people's opinions are context specific.
Mm-hmm.
And so in trying to tease out a qualitative interview, you don't really always have the luxury of understanding what the context is that a person's referring to when they're talking about a lived experience.
Yeah.
Or it's so broad that you don't know what the underlying motivations or emotions may be. But in conjoint analysis, while you probably could get a lot closer to knowing what the context is for a certain attitude or response, just the fact alone that it has so many contexts tells you whether people's beliefs are influenced depending on the kind of condition you're asking about.
Yeah, and I think that, so as I was kind of preparing my notes for today, I was reading I had a paper on my desk about some of the statistics behind this, to get to kind of, to riff off of my answer to Sarah, which is that I do kind of live with these fears that, I have been told by people who are, extraordinary political scientists who also do ethics work that these are valid methods. But they aren't the people who invented these statistical methods either. And so a lot of my concerns do come down to, making sure that as we pick this tool up, and as I showed, other people are kind of having a similar idea, that we're actually generating knowledge and just not cool statistics for use in ethics. But I do agree that, you know, a lot of the work on revealed preferences, as I understand it in ELSI, has come out of psychology, who do use these methods, but they often do it in like different kinds of ways. And I think this is a really excellent way to create like quite broad maps of people's preferences, which is what political opinion researchers do it. But we're doing it for kind of ethics work, as opposed to, perfecting our candidate statements or something like that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anna.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nick, for a beautiful talk. I'm wondering about the like setting up of the vignette or the case.
Yep.
Do you know, like, can you just imagine there's so many different ways of doing that to get at the underlying research questions? From kind of like, it was a dark and stormy night, blah, 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 like very rich setting, making it very personal, etc. Whereas, like, I'm really interested in potentially using this stuff for much more abstract things where I'm trying to just get at, in general, how people trade off certain values. So I can imagine writing something really specific. I can imagine writing something really abstract. And I'm wondering, how would I think about where on that continuum would get me the best results or the most sound results, I should say?
So I think two answers to that are, there's trade-offs no matter what, it's all trade-offs all the way down, as Dr. Shortland likes to remind me. And then the other one is that I think it depends partly on the kind of work that we're doing. So one of the people I ran this by is my co-PI, Dr. Shortland, and his work is with decision making by armed forces. So he often has to use rich detail because people refuse to answer certain kinds of questions unless they are given the appropriate amount of context. Why? Because they are people who serve in war, and he's asking questions about killing in war, and they actually need the detail to understand, to formulate the question, because otherwise they're like, it depends.
Yeah.
But I think that the other thing is that you can also run the risk, if you talk to the political opinion people, about inserting normative content into the bracketing language, that you then have to try and unpick whether or not you have framed the syntax of the vignette in such a way that it is leading the respondent. So, again, we're approaching this from kind of methodological pluralism. My sense for your question is that if we're talking about abstract concepts, like if we're trying to get them to reason in abstractions. Oh, I if you are trying to reason in abstractions, I think that there's a good reason to favor. I mean, this would be my guess. I think if you're trying to reason abstraction, giving people the ability to ground the things that really matter is like super, super important. So you don't like lead them into like almost mathematical like levels of abstraction. If you're trying to deal with like concrete normative issues like I am right now, I want to be careful that I'm not creating a particular kind of latency or like framing bias where I'm just I'm setting someone up to always answer the question in a certain way through ways that I don't anticipate. That's actually part of the reason why we just said a large clinical data set. We didn't say infectious disease in light of the COVID pandemic or human genomics or something like that, on the possibility that the subspecialty, to get to Camille's kind of questions about covariates, that the subspecialty actually matters. So I think that like these are, that more discussion would be needed about exactly which abstract concepts we want. But kind of having stalked you very briefly to think about, ethics and genomics, I can see how, abstract questions might be useful because genomic relationships are not necessarily like concrete entities at this point. And so we might want to kind of ground people where we can.
Thank you.
Nick, thank you so much for joining us today. It's really great to hear about your work, and I look forward to following up. If you'd like us to send any messaging out to the community that we're inviting to this forum to share information about your study, just let us know. And next month, we have our April forum. We'll have Dr. Cora Hahn, who's with the University of California Office of the President and manages one of our very, very large California statewide health data repositories, and we'll be talking about that. So have a good rest of your day. We'll see you next time, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you.